In 793, the Kingdom of Northumbria was attacked. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports that there were immense sheets of light rushing through the air, whirlwinds and fiery dragons flying across the sky. The monastery at Lindisfarne had been raided by wretched heathen men. These men burned down the building, desecrated religious artifacts, and took everything of value, including the monks themselves. Then they returned to their boats and sailed off into the sunset. At the time, these men were damned. The Chronicle refers to them as heathen men, or people who turn to the greatest possible perfidy and treachery. Nowadays, we call them Vikings, though there is some contention about this word. The label Viking is applied to men as far north as Iceland, as far west as the New World, and as far southeast as Constantinople. Not to mention the time difference. Lindisfarne was raided in 793, Iceland was settled in 930, Leif Erikson discovered America in 1000, and the Hagia Sophia was guarded by Scandinavians until the 1300s. How can we possibly group these raiders, settlers, traders and mercenaries under the same banner of Viking? The word Viking comes from the Old Norse Vikingur, meaning one who frequents inlets, coves and fjords. However, not everyone who frequents these areas can be understood as a Viking. When we say Viking, we generally mean people of Norse culture who, for some reason, migrate, either temporarily or permanently, from their place of origin in Scandinavia. In order to find out why Vikings Viking, we first have to discuss the reason why they migrated. Our story begins 30 years before Lindisfarne was raided. Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, was slowly destroying pagan Saxony south of Scandinavia, hoping to incorporate it as a province of his larger Frankish kingdom. Charlemagne was a devout Christian, believing that through conquering Saxony, he would spread Christianity to the people there, and consequently he would save their souls. Conquering the land had other advantages too. He could gain the trust of his fighters and his generals, promising them land after successful battles, which would increase their morale and his prestige. After Saxony was conquered, Christian lords ruled a pagan underclass who were inundated with the construction of churches, exposing them directly to church doctrine, converting them and saving their souls. By contrast, they used to live in small-scale kingdoms, known as fiefdoms. A small landholder would rule over his land with his extended family at his side. Slaves below him would work the land, the produce of which he would then use to support his lifestyle and position. Any consumer goods that he or his entourage made would be traded with the wider Germanic cultural area, in modern-day Sweden, Norway, Denmark and Germany. With Saxony, an area easily accessible from the Baltic Sea trade routes, now also easily accessible by the Christian world, the fiefs in Scandinavia had heard how rich the kings and lords within wider kingdoms could become, which made it a desirable position to them. Neighbouring fiefs throughout Scandinavia would compete for overlordship of each other, which can be done in many shrewd diplomatic ways, but the easiest way by far would be a bigger army diplomacy. Here we see similarities to Charlemagne's position. Landowners promised land and wealth to their fighters, but how would they ensure the loyalty of the men to whom they had given land? The most surefire way is by making the generals your children. Having a lot of strong, able-bodied children would put you in the most advantaged position for claiming the title king. Therefore, there was a glut of able-bodied, strong men. This glut of able-bodied, strong men would obviously be good for a fief. It would cement his position as a powerful landowner, and it would eventually allow him to don the title king. But at some point, there would be more strong children than there was arable land in all of Scandinavia. Children of both successful and unsuccessful landowners found themselves without land and without the wealth with which to buy land. How could these men, who were born into a culture which promotes fame and fighting, also born in a time of tumultuous war, possibly use their adept skills in war and battle? Kveldulf Bjarnason, shortened to Ulf, was a wretched heathen man who lived in the 8th to 9th century who had found himself in a similar position to this. He spent his adolescence raiding. He went to modern-day England, France, Spain and Italy, raiding places to earn his fortune. He came back to Norway as a rich man, buying ample land and slaves, having earned what he perceived to be his birthright. He tried to carve himself a place in the budding kingdoms within Scandinavia. He had two sons, Thorolf and Skallagrim. Here, we see how a Viking comes about. The raiders at Lindisfarne and any of the countless raids throughout Europe were comprised of the glut of strong young men, of which Ulf was simply one member. They raided, earned money, and then took their earnings back to Scandinavia, and then they bought land, allowing them to compete. either to become a king, or, as Ulf intended, oppose kingship altogether. To the east of Ulf, Harald Fairhair had recently inherited Oslofjord from his father. Otherwise known as Harald the Shaggy, he had vowed that he would not cut his hair until he became the king of the whole of Norway. Ulf was willing to work alongside Harald as an equal, and the two had agreed to an uneasy peace, wary of each other's actions. His son Thorolf, however, wished to work with Harald. Though he was welcomed at first, Harald had him killed for amassing too much influence within his court, believing Thorolf's motives to be to oust Harald and give the title King of Norway to his father. Infuriated by his son's death, Ulf killed Harald's servant who had taken part in Thorolf's murder, and, for fear of his life, he had fled westward, but not before swiftly dying on the journey, leaving his retinue in the hands of his now only son, Skallagrim. Skallagrim had then set up a settlement where his father's coffin had washed ashore, Borg, Iceland. Not everyone was a fan of kings. Some people preferred their freedoms before they had to deal with the ambitious kings. By the mid-9th century, some people in Scandinavia were either left unsafe in their own home, or without a home at all. These people ran. Modern-day Iceland, Greenland, England, Newfoundland, Scotland, Ireland, Poland, Germany, France, and Russia hosted new immigrants who had escaped Scandinavia in the hopes of living as their fathers or ancestors had. Their homeland had altered beyond recognition. Whether raiding, trading, or settling, these men were united by hatred of what their homeland had become. They can be seen to loathe the concept of kingship. Kings simply eroded their rights. They longed for a return to small landowners who answered to no higher power than Thor. This is reflected in medieval Iceland's settlement and government. Far from one king claiming to unite Iceland, the nation was formed from a confederation of powerful landowners known as Gothar, sometime around 930. Though some landowners were more powerful than others, all free men were permitted to attend the assembly, or the Althing, and decide on legislation there. Mutual contempt for kings and the concentration of power into one hand had brought about congressional leadership, a form of government which lasted until 1262. By the mid to late 10th century, there was very little land left for settlement by Vikings. Furthermore, raiding was now out of the question. England in the 8th century was ripe for the picking, but by the 10th century, the state structure had accustomed to the tactics of Viking raiders and settlers. Communication was quick and retaliation was even quicker. A Viking was no longer able to take their wealth through their fighting prowess, though they could sell their fighting abilities as a mercenary. When Ulf's grandson Egil was young, he fought his grandfather's fight against Eric Bloodaxe, the son of Harald Fairhair. When Eric inherited the throne of Norway, he had banished Egil, ordering that if he ever entered the Kingdom of Norway again, he would be executed. The feud between Egil and Eric fills most of an Icelandic saga, so it's a story for another time. But Egil killed Eric's son and escaped with his life. As Egil got older, it was harder to do these deeds directly. He had instead helped the English king, Ethelstan, by selling his services as a mercenary, having fought in the Battle of Brunanburh, one of the most important battles in English history. It was no longer an aim to become a king or fight against a king. Any wealth could only be obtained now through helping kings and receiving compensation for battle. 1066 is often given as the end of the Viking period. In the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, was killed in an attempt to take the English throne. Though this is not the end of the Vikings, it is certainly the end of measurable Vikings. After this point, they managed to blend into their native societies a great deal more. So, with this in mind, what is a Viking? A Viking is, essentially, a Norseman who was driven by external factors to leave his homeland. The major factor being that they had perceived a change of their homeland. Latin influence had led to kings, to which there was a cultural backlash. Individuals wished to gain a respectable homestead, where they could live from the land and defend from invaders, without an overarching king objecting or intervening. Though this past was somewhat imagined, there was a perception that liberties were gradually eroded under kingdoms. Ultimately, they had to play by the rules of this game. Newfoundland was abandoned, Greenland was cut off from Europe, and even Iceland, a nation founded on the concept of landowners' autonomy, was subsumed into the Kingdom of Norway in 1262. Though Norsemen did serve in the Varangian Guard in Constantinople, they had disappeared from traceable history. They disappeared so well, in fact, that it wasn't until the 18th century that Vikings were rediscovered, when they were given their horned helmets and were perceived as noble savages, a belief so culturally pervasive that it persists even today, despite the fact that we know the damage this has done and can do. You like dragons, so click on the left to learn more about them. You also like history and mythology, so click on the G to subscribe. And don't forget to like and comment. or don't.